Well, I'll tell you something, Missy. You sure do look pretty when you're angry. Uh-huh. Nope, it's not John Wayne, and it's not even Ted Baker, but it is Ted, the soundtrack guy. Today we're going to be talking about John Williams' lovely score for Steven Spielberg's 1989 fantasy drama romance film, Always, featuring one of the most breathtaking French horn solos in movie music history. Stick with me until the end of this video, and you'll have the opportunity to hear what I have to say about another Steven Spielberg fantasy movie that broke box office records. Not that that's any kind of a surprise where Spielberg is concerned, back when the movie came out, and the soundtrack has gone down in history as one of the greatest ever written. Steven Spielberg's Always was based on the 1943 film called A Guy Named Joe, and apparently, along with Steven Spielberg himself, Richard Dreyfuss was so enamored with this film that when he found out that Spielberg was interested in making a remake of sorts, Dreyfuss insisted that he be cast as the leading man in this movie. Now, to be completely transparent, Always is not my favorite Steven Spielberg outing, and audiences seem to agree, on Rotten Tomatoes at the very least, that this just didn't quite resonate with them as well as so many other Spielberg movies had in the past. But where Steven Spielberg is concerned, there's always something very special about every single one of his movies, and Always is no exception. There's a lot to look at here, a lot to treasure here, and a lot to be appreciative for here in the realm of both filmmaking and, of course, and most especially, in the realm of movie scoring, thanks to the brilliant John Williams. But let's take just a moment to consider some of the very special features of this particular soundtrack release. This is La La Land's 2021 remastered re-release of the soundtrack to Always, and it is limited to 3,500 copies, which have unfortunately already sold out. But for those of you who are interested in acquiring this particular album, don't lose heart. I'm sure you'll be able to find it from a secondhand seller somewhere on the internet. I can't tell you how many times I've missed out on certain soundtrack albums, and just with a little patience, a little diligence, I have come up with that title in my soundtrack collection after all. Now, before this release, Always enjoyed a previous soundtrack release on the MCA label back in 1989 when the film Always first came out, and that was actually a pretty good release, to be honest with you. It had great sound, although not as great as La La Land's gorgeous remastering in sound quality, but it was quite nice nonetheless, and was pretty complete too as the film score, and also offered a number of songs or source cues, so to speak, that were featured in the film's soundtrack, not written by John Williams. For instance, the Platters' Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. There was another version of Smoke Gets in Your Eyes on that album, as well as Cowboy Man and some others, and that was a wonderful little album. But La La Land's re-release is definitely superior in every way. We have fantastic liner notes by, of course, Mike Matessino, very detailed. I really appreciated these liner notes in particular. When I was reading them, I thought to myself, wow, this is like 20 or more pages of liner notes. And the first half or more was focused on the production element, the production history behind Always, which was really illuminating to Spielberg's career as a filmmaker, kind of gave some insight into Always' intertextuality, in the sense that while it is kind of an understated film in his filmography, it nevertheless plays a very important role in the overall package of films that he has produced as a wonderful Hollywood director. Now, it goes on in detail to John Williams' great movie music that he produced for Always, and then goes into very brief track-by-track notes for the entire album. Now, it would seem that the critics had an issue with Spielberg's supposed excessive sentimentality when it comes to this particular film, but I personally disagree. I love Steven Spielberg's sentimentality, and in fact, I've never seen a Steven Spielberg movie where it struck me that he was going overboard in that realm, although I've heard that criticism before about other projects beyond Always. But there are some things about Always that didn't quite work for me. It didn't quite gel at the end of the day, and I think it has something to do with the fact that, for me at least, the comedy didn't quite ever work right, and the casting, even though it's wonderfully acted, would occasionally shine so brightly with wonderful performances where they're just nailing it. But then there are other moments where just awkwardness was permeating the scene so heavily that it jolted me out of the movie experience. And ultimately, I think I was left trying to figure out what kind of movie this is. Now, granted, movies can be more than one genre, and in this case, I think it's fair to say that Always is a drama and a fantasy and also, of course, a romance. But again, for some reason, those elements very rarely settled into one another in a very married sense. Now, there were moments, of course, when that happened. And the music was the one thing that always was solid, that always gelled, and that was always very clear about setting forth what this movie was about. Now, interestingly, this movie starts out, first 20 minutes of this film, as a matter of fact, have no score whatsoever, which is a very rare thing for Steven Spielberg and John Williams. Now, I very much appreciate restraint in terms of film music. Those intentional moments of silence can be very effective in terms of waiting for the moment when the music actually does come into the picture, and then your effect is even that much more heightened because of your restraint, because you're feeling that push and pull of the drama, and you're not just painting wall-to-wall music over the entire film. But strangely enough, in this particular case, I think the choice not to have John Williams' music enter the scene until about 20 minutes into the film is part of the reason why I think the picture has trouble finding its footing and letting the audience know what sort of movie it is they're watching. For instance, much of the score to Always is very dreamy and very ethereal. You can almost feel and hear the breeze rushing through and around the space that you're in. It's not a melodic sound so much that it is atmospheric. There's a lot of harp runs and just beautiful kind of piano, gentle keys going on, maybe some electronic work, of course, to add to that atmosphere and that sense of almost fairy dust magic going on around you. And it's a super effective thing that John Williams does, and that really nails a lot of what this movie is in terms of its fantasy element, its supernatural element. And I feel like if we had had some kind of a taste of that earlier in the soundtrack, even if the movie itself didn't get there yet, but maybe somewhere in the opening credits or the opening scene or something, where we got this sense of this is going to be a fantasy, there's something supernatural going to come, and we just get a little bit of a taste of that, I think it really would have helped nudge the movie in a better direction for the audience to receive it the way that it was intended to be received. Now, on this La La Land album for the soundtrack to Always itself, this ethereal kind of music comes up quite often, and most notably, and I want to say the first time it shows up, is in the track Pete in Heaven, and that's an extended cue. It's almost like 7 minutes of this style of music that we've been talking about here, and it's just so gorgeous and lovely. And I thought to myself when I was listening to this soundtrack recently that, boy, this sounds a lot like the track Isn't It Beautiful from Heartbeeps, which was an old, mostly forgotten, and for good reason in terms of the film, 1980s film that John Williams scored. Great score, by the way. We'll cover that one eventually. And also I thought to myself, this sounds like Am I Beautiful from another John Williams soundtrack, which is, of course, Far and Away. And as I was reading the liner notes, Mike Matessino actually brought up those two tracks and also illuminated another one that I had missed in terms of my own recollections, and that was the track Fortress of Solitude from the 1978 Superman the movie. And when I read that, I was like, yes, that's another example. So that's the style that I'm talking about, and that really permeates a lot of what this soundtrack is. Less melodic and less theme intensive it may be, there are still at least 3 very striking and effective motifs that John Williams comes up with for this score. Most notably, probably the one for Pete and Dorinda's romantic relationship. It's very sweet, but is also kind of bittersweet, or at least suggestive of the idea that destiny itself is not going to allow them to stay together. They're going to be torn apart by and for reasons much bigger than they are, but that maybe that's okay. And perhaps that going through that journey of that love and that loss was integral to the two of them in discovering what their ultimate destinies were as individuals. There's a lovely and very subtle rendition of Pete and Dorinda's romantic theme in the very first track, Intimate Conversation. And it's kind of this ba 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 ba. And that goes through the entire score and finally finds its ultimate resolution in the fabulous and best track on this album, if you ask me, the track Among the Clouds. And that's where our French horn solo comes in most prominently, and we will discuss that in just a moment. It is worth hanging in there for. You've never heard anything like it if you haven't heard it yet. The track Saying Goodbye is another one of my very favorite tracks. It's the track that starts right after Pete decides to go on one more firefighting mission after having agreed with his love interest, Dorinda, that he will stop fighting fires because he's been taking too many risks, and he'll go and teach at a training school in Flat Rock, Colorado. And you can hear at the beginning of that track the strings all by themselves, very high strings, it's sort of an eerie, we get this sense that he's not coming back from this. He's not coming back from this. And after that, horns come in. And this makes me think of work that John Williams did in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade right here. And interestingly, I looked up the years just to be sure I wasn't off. And in fact, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is also a 1989 Steven Spielberg film. So John Williams was working with these ideas and had it in his psyche, and you could hear it here and in a few other places throughout the score, to always this kind of echo from Last Crusade, or vice versa if you want to look at it from the other direction. It's this bum 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 bum. And then the strings kind of come in as Dorinda gets on her bike to go and catch up with Pete, who's getting ready to jump into his airplane and go fight these fires, because she needs to tell him just one more time that she loves him. She's crazy about him. She's head over heels for him. And won't he tell her he loves her too? Because he's had trouble with that for some reason. He hasn't been able to say the words, although it's very clear that he does. And as she walks away, he shouts, "I love you!" But she can't hear him because the airplane propellers are going and the engine is there fired up, and she can't quite hear him. And as she's on that bicycle ride to catch up with him, that's when their theme really starts to get propulsive and builds up, and it's so wonderful. In fact, in terms of even the film itself, it's easily one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. There's a brief little track called Follow Me that sort of breaks with tradition in this soundtrack. It's a lot of fun, very whimsical, and emphasizes the comedic elements of this film. Now, I love this track. It's one of my favorite tracks too, but interestingly, also considering the alternates, there is an alternate version of Follow Me. as one of the 6 alternates at the end of this album. And I thought to myself when I heard that, I think in this case, I might have preferred that they had gone with the alternate take to Follow Me rather than the one used in the film, because the comedy, again, for me, didn't really work very well. And the alternate take to Follow Me emphasized, yes, it was a little bit whimsical for sure, but it also seemed to emphasize more the Ted and Dorinda are being pulled together almost by this magnetism beyond themselves. And I thought the alternate did a better job of communicating that idea. Toward the end of the album, we have 3 home run hit tracks in a row. The Rescue Operation track is a fantastic track that starts to build a lot of tension and leads to Dorinda's ultimate resolution of her inner conflict, not being able to get over the death of Pete and to move on with her life. And when she decides to go ahead and rescue the firefighters instead of let Ted go and do it. Now, Pete had convinced Ted to go and rescue these firefighters, and he was going to go off, and perhaps Dorinda couldn't stand the idea of losing someone else that she knew she loved. But also, more than that, I think more than that, it's about Dorinda herself. And that's something else I want to say real quick, because it does relate to the music and why John Williams' score works so well, is John Williams' score does emphasize Dorinda. I think this movie is her movie. It's confused a little bit because it tries to be Pete's movie too, but I think it's about Dorinda. And when she steps out on that runway and she decides she's gonna fly this thing, she's gotta do it for herself. It's about getting over Pete. It's about getting over the past and moving on and embracing her future and all that destiny has waiting for her there. And the music is just, you can hear it like, it's very subtle, but it's building. It's dum, dum, dum. And then electronically, ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. And she's gonna get in this plane and she's gonna do it. Even though she is a pilot, yes, but mostly she's an air traffic controller, and she's not prepared necessarily to do this, to fight this fire. But who is prepared, right? To fight those fires of inner turmoil and personal growth that we need to overcome in order to move on in our lives. And that is, of course, what's actually going on here. But also in that same track, the Rescue Operation, it harkens back to the very subtle version of this other motif that we haven't yet discussed, which is bum 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 bum. And it's almost like Pete's voice, Pete's ghostly voice, as he has been sent to guide and protect and illuminate and to free Dorinda from her trauma and all that she's facing here as a character. But that goes into and leads so nicely into her resolution motif, as I prefer to call it. And that is, of course, the ba 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 ba. And we get to hear incredible versions of that coming right up in the next track, Among the Clouds, and also in the track following Among the Clouds called Dorinda's Solo Flight. But let's camp on Among the Clouds for a moment. This is the track on this album. John Williams came up with the most incredible, most breathtaking French horn solo you have ever heard. And as I promised at the outset of this video, it is something that you have got to hear. This is price of admission. As much as I'm sure it's going to break your heart, I'm not even going to try to hum you a little snippet of this to give you an idea of what this is like, because I'm just going to do it a great disservice, believe it or not. And so you're gonna have to hear this for yourself. And after you hear that soaring, gorgeous, astonishing French horn solo, the music moves into this swelling, deeply, passionately felt string and flute section, and then goes back to French horn and string again and climaxes in this wonderful moment where we really feel the depth and reality of Pete and Dorinda's love. And more than that, we're convinced that Dorinda has finally been set free and that she's going to, in fact, have a wonderful life, just as Pete assures her she will in this scene. Among the Clouds is simply perfection, and it builds, even from the point that I had left off describing the music, into more French horn with harp runs too. Harp runs, it goes back into that ethereal area too, also in the midst of all of this swelling, melodic, passionate music. And then the second to last track, Dorinda's Solo Flight, is the third track of this wonderful triad of tracks on this album, and that brings us to the very end of the movie when Pete's ghost helps, in fact, saves Dorinda from drowning in her airplane after she's landed on the lake, and she comes up, and at that moment she breaks the surface of the water and she cries out, "Pete, Pete!" And you know that she's going to be okay. You know that she's been freed in her soul and in her spirit. And that's when she gets out of the water, and there's the rescue team, the emergency vehicles, and Ted Baker is there to embrace her and their future together. Now, the final track, End Credits, is a reprise of all of the best motifs and themes and melodic moments, as well as, of course, the ethereal texturing that the whole album treated us to. And again, I thought to myself, listening to the alternate of the end titles, which features John Williams' symphonic rendition of Smoke It's in Your Eyes, interspersed within the reprise of all the themes in that version, I thought, boy, I think I prefer that particular end credits song too over the one that they actually used. It kind of made me think of the Close Encounters end credits with When You Wish Upon a Star, how he wove that into his own themes and his own work for the soundtrack in the credit roll of that particular masterpiece. But in any case, this is a wonderful little score. I highly recommend you hunting a copy of this one down. John Williams is always worth it. No matter what, whether it's a small project, an intimate project, bombastic, it doesn't matter. John Williams is always going to knock it out of the park. This is no exception. Now, as promised, I want to turn you on to another incredible soundtrack by the great John Williams, another John Williams, Steven Spielberg collaborative effort for a film that is also a fantasy film of sorts, and which came out in the early 80s before Always, but that might possibly be the greatest soundtrack of all time. Now, is it my favorite soundtrack? Here at My Favorite Soundtrack, we're kind of on the hunt to find out, what is Ted the Soundtrack Guy's favorite soundtrack? I can't decide, but maybe you can help me decide as we move forward as a community. Click this video and watch what I have to say about this wonderful soundtrack, which just very well might be my favorite soundtrack. And what is your favorite soundtrack? Put that down in the comments. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining me, and as always, happy listening.